Next up, we got, and speaking of a different subject, we went from the megafauna, now we're going to sea cucumbers, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So Ben Wilkins is a grad student at APU. He's the program coordinator of Fisheries, Aquatic Science and Technology, or FAST Lab at APU, the dive safety officer, and an adjunct faculty. He's going to be talking about estimating abundance and spatial distribution of the giant red sea cucumber. Very excited. Welcome, Ben.
All right, thank you, Paul. Everybody hear me okay? Everybody all pumped up and emotional about sea cucumbers? Pretty amazing stuff. So as Paul mentioned, I'll be talking about habitat associations of sea cucumbers in Prince William Sound. So a little bit about me first. I grew up in Colorado, became a dive instructor. I worked in Hawaii and California for a long time. And I came up here to drive boats for Lazy Otter Charters. Big shout out to them, Mike and Kelly. Then I started grad school at APU, and I am now the dive safety officer there, and I help run the FAST lab at APU. So a little bit about sea cucumbers. This is the California sea cucumber, also known as the giant red sea cucumber. They range all the way from the Baja Peninsula in Mexico, all the way up here to Prince William Sound and out to the Aleutians. Prince William Sound is the northernmost extent of their range, so they don't go any farther north in the world. Typically, they live from 0 feet down to about 250 meters, which is about 812 feet. As we'll see in a little bit, most of them are a little shallower than that. They're echinoderms, so they're in the same phylum as sea stars and sea urchins and things of that nature. Basically, they just cruise along the bottom, sucking up sand. So they have about 20 tentacles around their mouth, and they just grab all the sediment, sand, mud, whatever they're in, and then they digest all the microbial matter in that sand. And they can also put their heads up into the current and put their tentacles out and filter feed in the current if there's not sufficient microbes in the sediment. They're pretty important. One of their main aspects of importance comes from them being prey species. So a lot of things feed on sea cucumbers. Up here it's mostly sea otters, harbor seals, the Pycnopodia that Gabby mentioned. Sunflower sea stars love eating these things. They also perform a super important task. They're bioturbators, so they go through all the sediment underwater. They're moving the sediment around, they're reoxygenating it, and they're basically redistributing biotic and abiotic elements in the sediment in that ecosystem, and that just allows for more biodiversity, more algae, more life in that sediment. So sea cucumbers are important commercially. Not a ton of people eat them around here and in North America. About 95% of all sea cucumbers caught in the world go to Asia, mainly Taiwan, South Korea, mainland China, and Hong Kong. They do have a chemical in their bodies called polysaccharide chondroitin sulfate. It's a mouthful, but it's supposed to be really good for joint restoration, some antiviral properties, so it's used a lot in food and also medicinally. So on the right here we have a figure. These are big fisheries around the world for sea cucumbers. On the x-axis on the bottom we have years, basically from 1950 until 2011. On the y-axis that's just gross tons caught. And you guys might notice that a lot of these kind of go up and peak and then they start to crash. And the reason for that is most fisheries for sea cucumbers in the world have been overfished. So you can see a lot of them crash around the 80s. That top one in the yellow is Japan, and they had a crash pretty early on in the 60s. And then they started doing some more sustainable techniques around the 90s, and you can see their gross tonnage actually went up. Here in the red in the middle, California is on the left and Washington State is on the right. They both had big fisheries down there. and they crashed pretty hard in the early 90s from overfishing. And then in the bottom right, we have Alaska. So in Southeast Alaska, there's a pretty successful fishery. It started a little later in 1984. And as we'll see, it's a pretty sustainable model, and tonnage keeps going up. So this is our model for fishing for sea cucumbers in Southeast Alaska. You guys will notice that there are 3 different colors, and basically we fish these areas on a rotational basis. So we'll only fish one area, one color per year, and rest the other 2, and then we just rotate them. So every area has 2 years to rest and recover in between fishing. This is pretty well established as the most sustainable model, and British Columbia, Canada has adopted it, and they're also doing pretty well. So, I also work for Fish and Game seasonally, and I was brought on to help put together the Southcentral Alaska Dive Team. And we were tasked with just going out into the sound and seeing if there's enough cucumbers to start a new fishery. And it's pretty rare in this day and age to start a new fishery. We've all heard about a lot of fisheries being shut down over time. So this was a pretty cool opportunity. As I mentioned, Prince William Sound is the northernmost extent of their range, and no studies had ever been done on sea cucumbers. So even after Exxon Valdez, when a lot of science was happening in the Sound, they chose to just never look at sea cucumbers. So we had no idea if there were any, where they were, if there were some. And as some of you know, Prince William Sound can be a challenging area for science. There is a lot of coastline. Prince William Sound has over 3,800 miles of coastline just in the Sound. To give you guys an idea, the east coast of North America has about 2,000. So there's more coastline in Prince William Sound than the east coast of America. So it's a lot of ground to cover, and it's also cold and deep. So we went out there scuba diving. To set up a new fishery, the first thing you have to do is a stock assessment. So you have to know how many there are, where they are, and get a general idea for biomass. So we set out doing dive transects. So basically we picked areas and then we picked random sites within those areas. We would drop a couple divers on the shore, and we would take a magnetic bearing perpendicular from shore. So we would decide what's perpendicular, basically starting on the shoreline and going down to 50 feet mean lower low water. So if the tide was like plus 8 feet, we go to 58 feet. If it was a -2 tide, we go to 48 feet, if that makes sense. So on the way down, we had 2-meter transect rods, as you can see in the bottom left there. And basically we were counting cucumbers on the way down. We stop every 10 feet of depth to collect data. So we have data from 0 to 10 feet, 10 to 20 feet, 20 to 30, and so on, all the way down to that 50 feet mean lower low water. We're also collecting data on sediment, so what the bottom looks like, if it's rock, sand, silt, gravel, things like that. Kelp species, so whatever the dominant kelp species was in that depth interval, as well as an estimate of percentage of cover of that kelp. So how much of the seafloor that kelp is covering. We also collected sea cucumbers. If we had more than 10 sea cucumbers on a transect, we'd collect them, bring them back on the boat and weigh them, and then we'd eviscerate them, clean them, and then weigh them again to get the market weight. So basically when you guys are doing underwater transects, sorry, I'm talking to my scientific divers in the room, but transects underwater, you have a few options. Something called a belt transect, where you put down a tape measure basically underwater. You measure everything on either side of that tape, which is great, but it takes a lot of time to lay that tape measure out. And then you obviously have to collect it again at the end, so it takes a lot of time. There's also a tracked roaming transect, where you actually are attached to a buoy on the surface with a GPS. That GPS tracks your transect, and you can have it mapped right away. But something that I developed for this project, I'm calling the SMB GPS method. Basically, as divers, we have something called a submersible marker buoy, which is basically a round orange tube that we have on us in case we get separated from the group or we're on a drift dive or something like that. And I figured we could just release that at our maximum depth, and then the boat could come and get a GPS point there. And from then we have a GPS point from where we started and where we ended. And from that you can calculate the length on the surface of the transect, and then using the max depth we can actually use the Pythagorean theorem to estimate our actual transect length. So the transect is going to be the hypotenuse. You guys might remember a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So that's how we're estimating our transect length. So it's a super quick, efficient way to estimate that transect length without having to tow electronics or have a tape measure underwater. So this is where we're at now. We started in 2021. We've done 424 successful transects out in the Sound. Almost 5,000 depth intervals where we recorded data. We had almost 5,000 sea cucumbers on transect. We collected over 1,000 sea cucumbers and weighed them, and we spent almost 5,000 minutes underwater so far. As you can see, we have fairly good coverage of the Sound. We do have one more survey in August, and we might hit Montague and Hinchinbrook down there. So this is Martin Schuster from Fish and Game. This is to just kind of show you guys how diverse it can be underwater. So we have a paired transect with two people right next to each other. And in this situation, Martin is in eelgrass and I'm on top of a garum kelp on a boulder. Basically what we found is that the environment itself is incredibly diverse. So on one dive we can see pretty much every different sediment type, kelp type, eelgrass on a lot of them, and it's just incredibly patchy and diverse on most of our transects. So here's some preliminary results involving depth and density. So on the x-axis we have our depth intervals, 0 to 10 feet, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. And on the y-axis we just have density, cucumbers per square meter. This figure on the left is our proportion of sea cucumbers at those depths. So if you add all those up, they'll equal 1. And as you guys can see here, at the very shallow depths, 0 to 10 feet, and the deeper depths, we don't see a lot of cucumbers. So the vast majority are going to be between 10 and 50 feet, with about 60% of them between 20 and 40 feet. And then on the right, we have just density with our depth intervals. Density on the y-axis goes from 0 to 0.1, and as you can see, the densities kind of mirror that proportion, with most of the cucumbers hanging out between 10 and 40 feet. So now we have substrate. So this is what the ocean floor looks like. So starting on the left, we have rock, boulder, cobble, gravel, sand, mud, silt, shell, and woody debris. Sea cucumbers have 5 rows of tube feet on the bottom of them, so they're basically like tiny little tentacles, and typically they have a really hard time holding on to fine sediment, so silt and fine sand and stuff like that. Basically prior research in Southeast Alaska and Washington shows that they have a really hard time living in silt. In Prince William Sound we have a lot of silt. We have a lot of glaciers and glacial runoff. And we actually, so the third one from the right is silt, and we actually had a really high density found on silt, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So this is a figure showing sediment again. And in the green, on the green bars, you have density. On the y-axis is density. On the bottom, you have depth intervals, and then on the right y-axis is the total area surveyed. So that's all of our depth intervals that had that substrate. So as you can see, like with sand in the very middle, we had a lot of transects with sand, moderate densities. Something that's interesting here, pretty high densities for silt. And also, as you can see, there's a lot of rock and boulder in shallower depths with pretty good densities as well. So here's just a photo of a giant red sea cucumber in silt. And it was cruising along and feeding, which is pretty rare. In prior research, as I mentioned, basically says that they can't live in silt. But we saw that many times. So another thing I did, for every transect, I put it into a category. Basically, it's just island, peninsula, bay, and passage. I think that kind of covers every possible spot of shoreline in Prince William Sound. And I basically just use that as a proxy for physical protection. We have a lot of wind fetch in Prince William Sound. We have very high tidal currents. So basically, every single site was placed into a category. This is a nice little shot of, we have a little island there. That's the southern tip of Esther Passage. So as you go higher up, those are passage. And then the spots that are more exposed are going to be considered peninsula. So similarly, the red line is the amount of area we covered. And the top of that, I don't know if you guys can read it, but it's about 14,000 square meters at the very top. So we did a lot of surveys in bays and passages. And from this, we can see that passages had super high densities compared to bays. We also looked at vegetation. So this is vegetative cover. We basically marked it 0%, 1 to 5, 6 to 25% vegetative cover. Not a ton of interesting information here. We did find that if there was a lot of kelp deeper, that generally signified that the water was clear enough for light to penetrate down there. Pretty healthy ecosystems. We did find higher densities of sea cucumbers, like when you have 51 to 75% vegetative cover at deeper depths. Generally, we found sea cucumbers. There's a lot of talk about climate change, obviously. As it's getting warmer up here, we're going to have more glacial melt. We're going to have more freshwater input, and that's going to lead to more silt from those glaciers. So we're going to keep an eye on it and see if that affects especially those glacial bays that we're studying, and see how that affects populations. So in summary, California sea cucumbers, we're studying them at their northernmost range, which hasn't been done before. We're developing some super efficient, cost-effective methods for doing transects underwater. The habitat preference is largely consistent with prior studies, with noticeable plasticity for fine sediment in low energy bays. So bays that don't have a ton of wind action and tidal current, they actually can live on silt. And then managers can use these tools to inform surveys and sustainable fishery management throughout Alaska. So with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Brad Harris, Dr. Nathan Wolf, and Jan Rumble on my committee, as well as the Fish and Game Dive Team, Martin Schuster, Jenny Morella, Alyssa, I think, is joining us, and Zoe, and Mitch, and Marley, and all my divers at APU. So with that, I'll take questions. No questions? Yep.
So is there going to be a sea cucumber fishery in Prince William Sound in the future?
That's the question.
That's the question.
That's the one I was waiting for. So we did open up a test fishery last fall. Some people had success and some not as much. So we'll see. I'm not involved with those decisions per se. But we have one more survey. But overall, the densities that we're finding in the Sound are not as high as in Southeast Alaska. And a lot of reasons for that may be the amount of fresh water pouring into the sound, silt, stuff like that. So the jury's still out on that one. Other questions? Yep.
How do you actually catch them? What's the fishery look like?
Yeah, so the fishery is all a dive fishery.
Okay.
So it's all on scuba or surface supplied air. So some people have compressors up on the boat and long hoses that go down. And it's all just catching by hand. And then they bag them up. And they're not allowed to go deeper than 60 feet. So it's somewhat safe.
I don't know quite how to ask this, but years ago, commercial fishing, my uncle would go dive down for sea cucumber. And then years ago, I did a Census Bureau survey throughout our community in Cordova. I'm just wondering if there is subsistence harvesting of sea cucumber, and if so, how much are they allowed to get, or if they still use those as the foods for subsistence lifestyle.
Yeah, totally. Sea cucumbers are legal to fish for subsistence-wise, and there's no limit on that. So citizens can go out and grab a sea cucumber and try it out. In North America, there are 5 longitudinal mussels inside of them, so most people pull the mussels out and eat those. Where in Asia, they'll dehydrate the whole thing and then rehydrate it and put it in soups and stews and stuff like that. So it's delicious, I think. I have some if you want some. Anybody else? Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben. Fascinating. What's underneath there? I saw AP presentation, senior project presentation about just right off Smitty Cove and what's down there, and it's really pretty amazing. Makes me want to go dive in. We got a break now till so enjoy your break, about 20 minutes or so. We'll reconvene at 10:40, actually 10 minutes. I do want to thank a couple of our sponsors, Glacier Jet Skis, Stan Steven Cruises, Discovery Voyages, Midnight Sun Brewery, Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council. Maya Draper Wright works for them. If you have questions about them, she's helping us out and is on our organizing committee for this symposium. VS Helicopters and Alpine Air, among others. Also, I want to remind you, we tried a little experiment. We're going to have what's called a found poem at the end of this. So it's another group activity. And so you've got little index cards. And so you can write down a line of maybe what Prince William Sound means to you, what's special about it, what you're doing this summer, whatever you want to do. And we'll combine that into a reading at the end of the day today. Also, always encourage you to look at us and join us as a member. So we will take a break. For those of you online, we'll be back at 10:40.